welcome everyone to this evening's program. On behalf of the chairperson, trustees, the Director General, members of the Museum Society Executive Committee, and on my own behalf, a very, very warm welcome to everyone this evening who are taking time off to attend this lecture of ours. And a very warm welcome to dear Dr. Rashna Poncha, a wonderful speaker. Got to know her over the last few months, and I have been attending her lectures whenever she's held them on Zoom. So Dr. Rashna, thank you so much for conceding to my request and agreeing so readily to address us. A few words about Dr. Rashna. Let me start by saying that she really is a very, very thorough research scholar in the old mold, but leading us into different and innovative ways of sharing history. So thank you, Rashna. I've always appreciated your lectures. And even if it's a topic of a simple street in Bombay, the detail which she goes into, you will be witness to it this evening, ladies and gentlemen. A few words about Dr. Poncha. She is assistant professor at the History Department, Sophia College Autonomous. She's passionate about teaching and about history. She completed her PhD thesis on a study of Freetown, Bombay, 1862 to 1947. And that was in the year 2016. And she was awarded the PhD very successfully in 2018. Her area of specialization is 19th century Bombay history. She is co-editor of the books, Mumbai, Socio-Cultural Perspectives, Contributions of Ethnic Groups and Communities, and Down the Corridors of Wisdom. It's a history of Sophia College. Dr. Poncha has presented papers on the Parsis, on the forts, the history of Mumbai city and its architectural heritage at both international and national conferences. Once again, a very warm welcome to you, Rashna. A few words about what we're about to hear this evening. The fort conjures up visions of grand walls, bastions, ramparts. And where would you find these in Mumbai? If only one looks closely, we find not one, but 7 small forts still standing in this crowded city. Rashna will tell us that there were even more. These British forts of Bombay were built and rebuilt over a long period of time. They were part of a land defense system built to protect the island from threats from our seas. Appropriately titled Lost Sentinels, the Forgotten Forts of Bombay, still stand today, tragically mostly in ruins and quite forgotten. This talk aims to tell their story and bring to light these amazing structures that are fast disappearing from our urban landscape. It's her talk, not mine, so I'll end there with this brief introduction. But before that, I would like to thank our technical team, so ably headed by Professor Jason Johns. And this evening we have with us Sanjana, Aishwarya, Mrinalini, and Yashraj. It's a new world. What would we have done without Zoom? And what would we have done without our young, technical, able, innovative, intelligent, and forward-thinking team? So thank you so much for joining us week after week for us to accomplish what we have set out to do. So thank you. And I once again hand myself and Rashna over to the technical team and welcome Dr. Rashna. We're looking forward to your lecture this evening. Thank you so very much. Enjoy the evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Godrej, for that very sweet introduction. Good evening to everybody. I'd like to thank the Museum Society for inviting me to come and give this talk. Thank you very much again to Dr. Godrej for inviting me. And I must say a thank you to Jason and the team, the technical team, who have been exceedingly helpful. So I'm just going to share my screen with you all, and we will start the story of these lost sentinels. And you will see why I like to call them my lost sentinels. So unbeknownst to most people, Bombay also had its share of protective forts. There were 9 such sentinels that ringed the islands and offered protection from invasion. We've also had a large number of batteries across the islands, but we will discuss the forts today. Unfortunately, most of these forts are in a terribly sad condition, and some of them have completely disappeared. So I just wanted to place you onto the islands of Bombay with our 7 islands that we keep talking about, Colaba, Old Woman's Island. This island, the H-shaped Bombay Island, is the actual Bombay Island, but we tend to give the term to the entire set of islands. Mazgaon, Parel, which is made up of Parel, Mazgaon, and Scion, Mahim, and Worley. Where did these forts stand? So if we start from south and take an entire ring around from east to west, the lowest one and the earliest is Bombay Castle. Then it got surrounded by the larger Bombay Fort. We had Bombay Fort, for a Dungaree Fort further to the north, Mazgaon Fort on Mazgaon Island, Silvery Fort, Scion Fort, Reva or Dharavi on the bigger islands, Mahim, an important fort on Mahim Island, and Worley Fort. So how did all these forts come about? So we need to take a little detour into our history, our past, and the islands of Bombay came under the Portuguese occupation in 1534, when they were handed over by the ruler of Gujarat, Bahadur Shah. It was actually Bassin or Vasai that the Portuguese coveted, and the islands simply came along as part of the surrounding territories. The islands of Bombay thus came under executive and judicial administration subordinate to Bassin. As the Portuguese were not really interested in these rocky, marshy outcrops, the islands of Bombay were rented out in order to supplement their income. And somewhere around 1554, during the viceroyalty of Dom Pedro Mascarenhas, the H-shaped Bombay Island was granted to a Portuguese physician named Garcia da Horta. It was given for a yearly quit rent equivalent to 85 pounds sterling. Da Horta built a large manor house, or quinta as it is called, at the southern end or the southeastern tip almost of the island. And he was a very keen botanist, and he built or surrounded the entire quinta with lots of wonderful fruit trees and beautiful spacious gardens. Bombay Island remained under Da Horta till his death in 1570, after which it seems to have been granted to several others, the last of whom was Dona Inês de Miranda. She was the widow of a Portuguese nobleman, and she is often referred to in the sources as Senhora da Ilha, or Lady of the Island. The islands changed hands once again in 1661 when they were handed over to the British Crown as part of the marriage treaty of Charles II of England and the Infanta Catherine of Braganza from Portugal. As per the treaty, Charles was given Bombay with all the rights, profits, and territories attached to it. The British government sent Sir Abraham Shipman to India along with 500 men to take possession of Bombay. But it was not to be an easy transfer. The Portuguese governor refused to hand it over for 3 years, quibbling over terms in the treaty. Shipman was forced to dock further to the south on the island of Anjadiv. And there, cooped up upon ship with not enough supplies, more than 3/4 of the men, including Shipman, died. Shipman's secretary, Humphrey Cook, finally signed the Treaty of Cession, accepting Bombay Island without its dependencies. The signing of the treaty took place in the Casa Grande, the Grand House, or the Manor House as we called it, and the island of Bombay was handed over to Cook on the 18th of February 1665. When the islands were under the Portuguese, they don't seem to have made much effort towards any kind of security or built any kinds of defense structures here. The manor houses did have some defense walls and some guns, but for the protection of their Portuguese owners. When the British under Humphrey Cook actually took over the island of Bombay, one of his first priorities was to make the island safe from attack. But the East India Company's council in Surat was not too keen to part with their money and pointed out that if the king had wanted it to be fortified, he would have sent the money. It took the outbreak of war with the Dutch in 1665 to build the actual fortifications. And Cook built a large platform, 51 yards long, with 18 pieces of ordnance or cannon on it, which was quite close to the manor house. He claimed that it was built strong with lime and stone and would last many hundred years. A landward wall of coconut trees and turf was also built with the help of local labor, who it seems were not paid with money, but with, and I quote, something to drink. These rudimentary attempts at fortification would continue under the next governors. Cook's fortifications have often been criticized as they were built on an outcrop of rock abutting from the sea within a short distance of Dungaree Hill. Dungaree Hill stands where St. George's Hospital, or stood where St. George's Hospital stands today. They felt it would have been better if the fortifications had been built further to the south at a place called Mendham's Point. Mendham's Point is today where the Maharashtra State Police headquarters stands. This would have made it closer to the docks where the shipping could have been protected. It would have been further away from Dungaree Hill, and there was a good supply of fresh water from a spring over there. When the East India Company took over the islands, the court of directors told the council in Surat to begin fortifications. And George Oxenden, the president of the council at Surat, was instructed from London to enlarge and strengthen the existing fortifications so that they may resist a potent enemy by sea and land. This was done under the next governor, Gerald Ainger, who built a small fort and enclosed the manor. We have a description of this fort from a report to the directors dated 15 December 1673. Ainger describes the fort, and this is the small fort over here, describes the fort as sitting on between two bays on a narrow neck of land. It was a quadrangular fort with 3 points overlooking the sea. 1, 2, 3 bastions overlooking the sea, and the bays, and the fourth overlooking the town and the plain in front of the castle. Ainger says that it was quite small, but it was very strong. And the castle of Bombay, when finished, will be of great strength and security to the town and to the whole island. The landward wall was 27 feet in height and 25 feet in breadth, with an inner and outer wall of stone. The two seaward walls were 20 feet in height and 42 feet in width, on which were mounted 36 pieces of ordnance. Each bastion was mounted with 50 pieces of ordnance on carriages. So a bastion is essentially a projecting part on a fortification, which is built at an angle so that you have various angles at which your guns can be aiming. So you can fire in several directions. Ainger didn't care much for the irregular shape of the fort, and he criticized engineers for not ensuring that that spring of water was taken into the fortifications. The governor's house, which was the old manor house, lay in the middle of the fortification. They also built a tank for fresh water because the spring was still outside. And at this point, there was no ditch or moat for this fort. Dr. John Fryer, who came to India as a physician with the East India Company in 1673, tells us that those fortifications did manage to withstand an attack by the French fleet in February of 1673. And the Dutch found themselves facing quite a large amount of firepower in the form of 100 cannon on the fort and 80 pieces at other convenient stands. Bombay Castle was not just the seat of early government, it was also the center of its social life. And dinner parties were frequently held in the Great Hall. The entrance to the castle is through a large gateway that probably belonged to the manor house. It has two Portuguese soldiers holding a globe, and the doors are made of teak and had several coatings of tar over it. Above the gate is the lantern, in which you could have one soldier. John Burnell, who came to Bombay in 1710, has left a wonderful account of the island. He describes the Bombay Castle as square with four bastions. Two of the bastions, Tank Bastion and Crabtree Bastion, which he calls Plum Tree Bastion in his letters, towards the land, were larger of the four bastions, and you had the Flagstaff Bastion and the Cavalier Bastion on the water. Now, if you notice from the older plan, this actually is land that has been reclaimed, because originally even Tank Bastion stood on the water, but the docks have been built up here, including the mint. So land has been taken in and your Tank Bastion went inland. The ramparts were large and kite-shaped, mounted with 112 pieces of cannon. They were made of earth and stone and covered in turf. Gerald Ainger had felt that mud and turf walls would be very strong. So his fort actually just had mud and turf walls, because he thought that in the first monsoon that mud would settle and it would create very solid walls. Unfortunately, quite the opposite happened. The first monsoon came and the mud got washed away. So stone had to be added in order to give a strong foundation. Burnell talks about a ditch in the process of being constructed. Ainger, remember, had criticized the fact that there was no ditch or moat. However, Burnell tells us that while digging out the dirt for the ditch, the Crabtree Bastion actually developed cracks. And so at that point, the idea of the ditch was abandoned. And we never really hear about a ditch being made again, but we do have a later map. This is a map from 1827, in which we can quite clearly see that there is a ditch on the landward side of the castle. So that was definitely made later on. Burnell also mentions a hornwork close to the Flagstaff Bastion. Ainger's report also tells us that there were two hornworks which defended the bays on either side of the fort, and that these were made of mud and turf. But unfortunately, these don't seem to have survived. So hornworks would have two demi-bastions with a curtain wall in the middle, and they would be connected to the main fort via these parallel wings. But we have absolutely no evidence of these anymore. Once the larger fort of Bombay came up, the castle was no longer the center of the social or political life of the town. The governors moved out and finally away from the fort itself. The castle continued to be used as the powder magazine, and the Flagstaff was still raising the flag every morning and evening. And apparently the Flagstaff Bastion became extremely popular for evening strolls for the inhabitants of the fort, sorry. So these are some pictures of what the fort may have looked like. So this is the English fort of Bombay, as we can see, with the four bastions. This is the seaward view, that is the landward view. This is a lovely picture of it from Samuel Scott's painting Ships in Bombay Harbor from 1730. And you can quite clearly see the castle out here. Another one from 1750, where you can see the castle actually quite large on the water and the ships in the harbor and Bombay, and that is the cathedral. Now, this is a view looking at it from the north downwards. So actually the castle would have been right here. So this is the town of Bombay. This is where the life centered. And we have another lovely view of it from the opposite side, which is, of course, from Malabar, where you can see the town of Bombay down here. This is a lovely old drawing of the castle. And if you look here, this does seem to have been where the ditch was, but you can see there doesn't seem to be water in it anymore. This is a image of it from the Bombay Castle, but you're looking at it from the fort walls of the eastern ramparts. And now you can see it from the town itself. We have the Asiatic Society building. The castle is behind it. You can see some of its ramparts, the Flagstaff you can see over here. We are lucky enough to have two photographs, old photographs of Bombay Castle. And if you look carefully, the water is right here. Today, Bombay Castle is very far away from the water. And this again is a view of Bombay Castle's ramparts looking out onto the harbor. It was not long before it was felt that Bombay Castle's fortifications were inadequate protection for the growing town. However, it was not until 1715 and Governor Charles Boone that this finally came to fruition. A wall was built around the town of Bombay. Charles Boone fortified it with a strong guard, three gates, this is 1, 2, and 3 big gates, and a large bastion on which they had 12 cannon overlooking the harbor. He had a Latin inscription placed in the key of the arch of the Apollo Gate, that's the gate over here, at the finishing of the town wall on the 1st of June 1716. This is what was written on that plaque. Essentially reads the Honorable Charles Boone, Governor of the island of Bombay, Gubernator Illustrissimo, meaning illustrious helmsman, someone who steers, and the date 1st of June 1716. This is that plaque. It stands in the CSMBS. The constant threat of the Marathas and the French in the mid-18th century led to the strengthening of the fortifications. And in 1739, the native merchants of Bombay, fearing a Maratha attack, voluntarily contributed 30,000 rupees towards the construction of a ditch all around the fort walls. You can see the ditch over here like this, rounded. This is why it was often referred to as the Maratha Ditch. It was completed in 1743 at the cost of 2.5 lakh rupees. And this seems to be the pattern that emerges around the Bombay Fort. Surveys in 1753 and 1758 by Captain Jacques de Funck and Major Mace, respectively, showed that the town was in an undefended position, and each time new plans for additional fortification were drawn up. The Bombay government would agree with the plan, but the Court of Directors in London would veto it on the grounds of extravagance. The Bombay government even levied a 10% tax on the produce of all the landed estates in order to reimburse the company for the expenses of the fortifications. So sporadically, over a period of time, new bastions and ravelins were added to the fort. And we can see this in the early maps. So as you can see from here, we move to Gross's plan of 1750, where the walls are now pulled out onto the eastern sides as well. This is a much later map, but a wonderful plan of 1827, where we can see the original wall, and the moat has been expanded and ravelins have been added into the moat, and escarpment or glacis has also been made over there. So this is the Fort of Bombay in 1863. Now, it was not only the building of new walls that was expensive. The demolition of the houses and the coconut trees that stood outside the walls was also expensive. For example, in November of 1760, the government ordered the demolition of a Portuguese church that had stood close to the bazaar gate on the grounds that an enemy could easily use it to approach close to the gates. So the church had to be rebuilt at a different site, and this cost the government 18,000 rupees. So the directors in London were just not pleased with these expenses. When the fortifications were first erected, very little land beyond what was absolutely required was cleared of coconut trees. So this left the space inside the fort and outside it as coconut groves. But in 1772, fearing a possible French attack, the government cleared and leveled a semicircular expanse of land directly adjacent to the fort walls in order to provide a clear range of fire from the fort. It started out as 400 yards from the ramparts, was extended to 600, then 800, and finally 1,000 yards in 1804 in order to ensure a large open space around the fort walled town. So this red mark is the fort, and this larger green part is that large open space that was cleared of everything. From time to time, they would cut down all the trees that were on it as well in order to have the clear field of fire from the fort. This was called the Esplanade, and it stayed there for many years. And this is a wonderful, wonderful photograph we have from the cathedral. You're seeing all the buildings inside the fort, and you can see the large Esplanade over here. There were roads running through it, there were wells on it, but you could not build buildings on it. Here you're looking at the Esplanade again, straight down across to the sea. This is the outer church gate. So 3 large fortified gates provided entry into the fort. At the southern end of the walls stood the Palva, or as it was later on called, the Apollo Gate. The Apollo Gate stood more or less where the Wellington Fountain stands today, opposite Regal Cinema. So this is actually a photograph of the Apollo Gate. You can see the naval dockyard inside, and here you get a very clear image of the ditch, the ravelins on the outside, and the drawbridges. The drawbridges didn't open and shut, but they had drawbridges over the moat itself. This is a lovely picture of the same scene, a painting, the view from the Apollo Gate with your Scotch Kirk and Admiralty House and the dockyard, and you see the same view even today. This actually pretty much same, with the exception that Kama Oriental came up here instead of the ice house. In the center part of the walls, where the present Flora Fountain stands, stood the church gate. It stood at the end of the street on which St. Thomas's Cathedral, the first Anglican church in Bombay, stood, hence its name. So this is Church Gate Street. This is the inner church gate, and you can see the walls quite clearly. The moat no longer has water in it because this is just about when they have started demolishing the fort. This is the outer church gate. You're looking at the outer church gate and the Esplanade. This is the inner church gate. You can see the moat over here. And this is Church Gate Street, the street on which you would have Akbar Ali's today, with, of course, the inner church gate over here. The Bazaar Gate stood at the northern exactly opposite today's General Post Office. Even today, it's called Bazaar Gate Street. It had 3 inner and outer gates and was called Teen Darwaza. So here you can see 1, 2, and 3. You can see the ravelins, the moat, the drawbridge across. This is a lovely painting from 1820 where you can see the 3 gates from the Esplanade. And here you have the outer and the center Bazaar Gate in the process of being demolished. The moat is quite dry at this point. So the Church Gate and Apollo Gate were double gates. The Bazaar Gate was a triple gate. All these gates closed at sunset. The Bazaar Gate stayed open for a little longer for government employees. So government employees who were working inside the fort and had to leave it could go out till 9:30 in the night. Nobody was allowed under any circumstance to enter the town after sunset. Those who came late stayed outside. And the garrison fired guns to indicate the time of sunrise and sunset. The ramparts also had sally gates. So a sally gate was a kind of controlled opening. So you protected the door with some kind of wall so that, an enemy could not fire at that door from a distance. So you have these sally gates, and the most popular sally gate, we are told, was in the center part of the walls. It's this one over here, just north of the church gate, directly opposite what would be the Alice buildings at Flora Fountain today. The other, this one here, led to the outer Maidan. This leads to what will later on become Mayo Road, or as it is called today, Karmavir Bhaurao Patil Marg. That's the road on which the university and the High Court stand facing the Oval. There was a third sally gate in the almost unbroken line of the eastern ramparts, and this sally gate had a drawbridge which gave access to the eastern foreshore. By the mid-19th century, these large ramparts had begun to feel obsolete and were a troublesome burden. There was no longer a threat to the British, as all the major enemies had either been vanquished or had ended hostilities. From 1845, many chief engineers and commanders-in-chief had put forward the idea of removing the western ramparts, as they were quite useless for the practical purpose of defense and in fact were an inconvenience for the local populace. The better option would have been to improve harbor defenses, as these would then of course make these ramparts quite redundant. By 1850, we are told that the fort was like a large basket so stuffed full of goods that they threatened to fall out of it. In fact, Dinshawatcha tells us that the fort walls, no longer required for defense, were often used to hold weddings. Even in 1848, an attempt had been made by the Fort Improvement Committee to remove some of the ravelins. But there was a wave of opposition, surprisingly, from the native community, who were reluctant to lose what they saw as their security. Under the governorship of Lord Elphinstone, who was governor here from 1853 to 1860, a further attempt was made to remove some of the fortifications. By the early 1860s, the reasons for holding onto the fort had become superfluous. The population had increased to the point where more people lived outside the fort than within. There were around 800,000 in the entire city, and only 40 to 50,000 lived within the fort. And the city was still growing at a rapid pace. So this is a map of 1855. This shows you the native town, heavily clustered. And this here is the Esplanade, and you can see the latter part where you've got the fort. Inside the fort also it's extremely crowded, and all this land is open and vacant. Land was urgently required for airy streets and houses. The high walls interfered with the circulation of air and occupied a large space in what is the busiest part of town. And the ditch, with its foul and stagnant water, was responsible for the spread of disease. In the monsoon, the ditch would flood, and the filthy water with all its sewage, because people threw sewage into the ditch every day, would overflow. This would then seep into the potable water sources like wells and tanks, and every monsoon, virulent cholera outbreaks killed thousands in the city. So finally, in 1862, Governor Henry Bartle Frere gave the orders for the removal of the obsolete fortifications. Sanction for the demolition was granted from London, and work began in January of 1863. The large fort of Bombay was demolished in its entirety. Not one tiny trace of it has been left. So we are lucky also again to have some pictures of the fort. These are the fort walls. You're looking out on the Esplanade. This is looking south. This is Colaba. These are the Grants buildings at Colaba. So you have your fort, and this is the escarpment out here, the glacis. This is the harbor face wall of the fort. Again, another picture of the harbor face, and you can see how the houses here are tight cheek by jowl. They're made out of wood, and that was one of the biggest worries that they had, that these tightly, clenched houses out there, if somebody fired across at them, it was going to be a huge problem with fire, etc. Here you have another one. Again, you can see the tightly bound houses, the fort wall, and this is a ravelin in the middle. And this is a well. There were many wells out on the Esplanade, and locals would come out over here to draw water because there was no piped water as yet. In fact, it's only after the fort was brought down that the piped water came in. So now what about the other forts? They were called the out forts. So some sort of protective structures seem to have been present at Mahim, Dharavi, Scion, Sivri, and Mazgaon, even when Cook landed up on the islands. So he's given some sort of inventory, and he calls them Rickety Forts. These seem to be some sort of very rudimentary protection for the villages that stood there. Fryer's account of the island says that there were small lines and guard houses at Mahim and at Scion, and that sharp-edged stones and old timber with spikes were sunk into the sea so as to stop anyone from crossing there. Unfortunately, we have very limited and very often conflicting information about these outforts. But what is quite evident is that, like the large Bombay fort, these outforts were also treated the same kind of indifference, restored and added to when there was need for security, and then left alone when the threat was no longer imminent. And we can follow these ups and downs from reports sent to the Court of Directors in London, as well as the works of writers like Fryer, Burnell, and James Douglas. The fort closest to the castle was Dungaree Fort. Dungaree Fort was built by the British on Dungaree Hill. So between 1678 and 1682, the Siddhis had continually plagued Bombay, but nothing much had been done. In February of 1689, the Siddhi Admiral Yaqut Khan had landed at Sivri. He then raised batteries on Dungaree Hill and trained them down on the Bombay Castle, sorely testing the East India Company, who, I quote, passed the months from April to September very ill. So this has gone on for quite a long time. They could not leave the castle and provisions had begun to run out. Finally, the East India Company sued for peace with the Emperor Aurangzeb, who consented to withdraw the Siddhi on condition of the payment of 1.5 lakh rupees. Actually, it was Aurangzeb who had sent the Siddhi to punish the East India Companies for their activities in Bengal. So the British decided that a fort needed to be built on the hill. A small fort was built on Dungaree Hill, and John Burnell was commander of the Dungaree Fort for about 11 months in the early 18th century. The Dungaree Fort was situated on the hill such that the seaward side was an almost perpendicular escarpment. It was a small square fort with 2 angular and 2 round bastions. In the center was a guardhouse and officers' quarters, which was further protected by buttressed 4-foot-high walls. There was also a large water tank inside. Now, a survey of Bombay's fortifications in 1752 unfortunately show us that Dungaree Fort is not being looked after, because apparently there are 19 guns at Dungaree, of which most of them did not even work. By 1755, it was found that the fort was too weak, could no longer bear the weight of big guns or mortars, and to make matters worse, houses and streets had come too close to the base of the hill. So the survey of 1758 by Major Mace raised this very real fear that Dungaree Fort was dangerously close to the town, as you can see, very close to the town. And if an enemy managed to get hold of it, they could lay the whole town in ashes. So the recommendation was that either the entire Dungaree Hill be enclosed and brought within the town walls, or the fort on it be destroyed and the hill leveled. The decision was finally taken to destroy the fort and level the hill. The fort was blown up in 1769 and the hill itself slowly leveled. The rubble was used for filling the adjacent Modi Bay. On 1st of January 1770, the foundation was laid for a new fort on the site where Dungaree Hill had once stood. It was named Fort George in honor of King George III. Over the next decade, work on the smaller Fort George continued. It had 3 bastions, bomb-proof casemates. It had 2 magazines for powder, stores, as well as a rainwater cistern for water. A palisaded ditch was built around it, as well as a glacis, just like the big fort. Gun platforms were built, and the esplanade outside that fort was also cleared of buildings and leveled. It had a drawbridge and a covered walkway and joined up, excuse me, with the bazaar gate ravelin of the big fort over here. When the larger fort of Bombay was demolished in 1863, most of Fort George was also demolished. The other outforts stood along the eastern and western foreshores of the islands. So we have these older maps that do point out these forts. So this Fryer's map of 1672 showing us Mazgaon, Scion, and Mahim. This is a reconstruction. It's not a map saying Queen Anne, where you can see the other forts. So it shows you Dungaree Hill, the fort at Mazgaon, the fort at Sivri, Scion up there, Mahim across here, and Worley. And this is a later map of 1724, which is, of course, now the direction has changed. So this is south, this is north, and this is the larger Bombay Island. It's showing you the town and fort of Bombay, Mazgaon, Sivri, Scion, Mahim, and Worley. So we can see that there are small fortifications around throughout this time period. Now, the earliest that we hear of these outforts is when we hear of a rebellion in 1863. Sorry, this is a later map by Niebuhr of 1764, again giving us even Riva. I can't point out to it because every time I go up there, my cursor sort of disappears. But if you look just up here, there is Riva Fort, or what is Dharavi Fort as well. So 1683, we are told that there was a rebellion by the commander of the troops named Captain Richard Kegwin against the governor, Sir John Child, because he believed that Sir John Child was grossly mismanaging the island. And he built fortifications at Mahim and Scion. The rebellion was brought to an end in 1685, but it does seem to have set off something, because in 1686, the Bombay government writes to the Court of Directors saying that the smaller forts need work if they're going to be used for any kind of defense. So in a little bit of detail. So when the Siddhi Yakut had landed at Sivri, he had then hoisted his flag at Mazgaon Fort. The fort had been abandoned by the soldiers just on news of his arrival at Sivri. And Mazgaon Fort was a small fortified manor house from Portuguese times that belonged to the families that had leased the islands. When Yakut left, he apparently razed the entire manor house. Now, he obviously didn't raise the whole thing, because later on in the early 1700s, Burnell tells us that Mazgaon Fort was an old thatched house with 4 iron guns, mounted on ship carriages, and was not very useful. It had a flagstaff on its southern end and was commanded by a sergeant and had 24 men under him. But it doesn't seem to have been regarded with any kind of importance. And that survey of 1752 showed that there were only 2 guns at Mazgaon. Silvery Fort, according to Burnell, was on the slight hillside. We can't identify exactly which hill, because Burnell calls it Mira Hill, and we have never been able to figure out what Mira Hill was. This was slightly different to the other forts, had a large entryway and 2 round bulwarks, after which you've got large ramparts on the side, and at the end it rounded off in a demi-bulwark. There were 4 brass swivel guns on it, and it had a very good view of Elephanta Island and of Trombay. The fort at Mahim seems to have started out as some sort of watch house. In September of 1686, the government in Bombay wrote to the council at Surat that the watch houses at Worley and Mahim needed to be replaced, and that it would be cheaper to build forts there than to try and repair them. And so in 1695, they finally get permission, but yet work will only start in 1701. Stone was brought in from Worley and other places, and we are told that they tore down old warehouses at Mahim in order to supply materials for the fort. So work continued there for 2 years. By the time Burnell comes to Bombay in 1710, the fort at Mahim has been constructed, and it stood upon an extreme point of the island on a low sandy foundation. It's actually standing literally on the beach, with the sea and the Mahim River, as he calls it, washing its shoreline. So it was in the form of a square having 2 bastions and 1 demi-bastion. It had a large gate and very strong ramparts, and was apparently built entirely of square stone of very good quality. Now, Mahim, therefore, was obviously quite an important fort, because the officer that commanded the fort was also the lieutenant of the fort at Scion and at Mazgaon. He had a company of 60 men. We believe the fort was designed by an engineer called Van Duten. Van Duten was also the commander-in-chief at one point of the garrison at Mahim and the overseer for the fortifications there, because the Bombay Consultation Book of 1703 tells us that he was to receive 1,000 seraphims towards carrying on the work at the fort at Mahim. Scion Fort, which stands up here on the hill, was also built around 1702. 50 sepoys were garrisoned there under a subedar, and the fort was mounted with 8 to 10 guns. Again, we get a very good description of this fort from Burnell, that it stood on the summit of a high round hill at the northeastern corner of the island. It had a round twisting ascent leading to it. The garrison itself was large, built of stone, but a very irregular shape. It had a guardhouse, a magazine, and a parade. But already it seems to have fallen into some disuse, because he says it had only 2 guns, even though there were quite a few embrasures. Embrasures are those holes through which the gun can be fired. There were no gates on the hinges, and Burnell tells us that the fort was somewhat ruined. But he does say that it had a wonderful view of the island all the way down the south to the Bombay Castle and at ships and of the ships in the harbor, as well as of Mahim and all the way to Bassein on the other side. Now, we're very lucky to be able to see that view, because we have these 2 paintings of James Wales done from Scion Fort. So this is looking southwards towards the Bombay Castle and the ships in the harbor. And this other one is looking towards Mahim, which is here, and Bandra, which is across the creek. And this, you can see a little bit of the fort over here at Scion. Worley Fort, according to Burnell, was built at the extreme north point of Worley Island, right here at a steep promontory that jut out into the sea. Now, Burnell tells us that it was a long and irregular fort having 4 or 5 bulwarks and built of large rocks laid one on top of the other without any mortar or chunam or lime to cement them together. At the eastern end, there was a broad rampart and a parapet. And the entrance was through a large gateway. You had to ascend a few steps before entering the fort. There were small officers' quarters, a small magazine, and a flagstaff. And at the extreme end of the fort, you ascended steps further into a semicircular bulwark, which was paved with stones and covered overhead with kadjan, which are coconut palm leaves. It had several embrasures, but only 2 guns in the whole fort. It was commanded by a commission officer and had a garrison of 12 soldiers. But today's Worley Fort looks rather different. So this is obvious that at some point the fort has changed. It was rebuilt, but unfortunately we have absolutely no idea when this was done. And this small square fort, which is still there, was apparently used in the early 20th century as a dwelling house for subordinates in the customs department. And in 1910, the PWD took it over. So 1722, we have news that the Portuguese fired upon Mahim Fort. So if you can see, Bandra and Mahim are facing each other just across the creek. And the Portuguese fired from Bandra onto Mahim Fort. The English apparently shelled them in return and damaged Bandra Fort. In August of the same year of 1722, they attempted an invasion between Sivri and Scion. In 1737, the president told the court of directors in London that he had been around the islands and he had been shown a place between Scion and Sivri that was presently defenseless, and the water was deep enough for an enemy to come by ship. So they decided that they would build a small fortification there. However, finally, when it came down to it, they didn't have enough money to build a fort. So they decided they would use flat-bottomed barges on which guns would be mounted. And this could then sort of patrol the creek over here. The same thing was decided for the stretch between Sivri and Mazgaon also. So this entire stretch here The reason for this happening is because there were reports that the Marathas were intending to attack Bombay. And so this need for extra defenses on the east can be seen over here. Dharavi itself was built later on. As you can see right up here, it says Riva. It's also called Riva and sometimes Kala Kila. So the Bombay consultations of 1737 point out that Dharavi, at low tide, people could cross easily from Solset. And there seems to have been some small stoneworks there, but it was not sufficient. And so a small fort was built there in 1737. We actually have a stone plaque in Dharavi which bears out this date. And this plaque happens to be just about the only plaque that you will find in any of these forts. You can't find anything in any of the others. In 1739, it was found that the opening of the Great Breach, which is our today's Haji Ali, was completely defenseless. So began up some fortification there. The plan was to build a small redoubt or a fort to protect repairs if possible. So 70 repairs, the storerooms and the magazines were in a wretched state, and the gunpowder therefore could be spoiled by rains. The roof had decayed in this. Nothing much seems to have been done. In 1752, a survey again was carried out, helps us to see that there was at 1750 Silvery, Mazgaon, Dungaree, as well as Butcher's Island, which you can see over here, as apart from the batteries. The board was informed that the outforts were in a very bad shape. The works in general were decayed. Most of the gun carriages were unserviceable. So the order was given, replace the gun carriages, but the rest of it, only that which is of immediate necessity, should be worked on. 1753, a fresh survey was carried out. This is the survey by Captain Jacques de Funck. He was to survey all the existing fortifications and give his suggestions as to whether the alterations were required and what they should be. However, Captain de Funck seems to have disappeared for the next few years, and we keep seeing these things in the consultations that he hasn't come back, he hasn't given us the report, we don't know what he's doing. Finally, in 1757, Major Mace was sent from England as principal engineer to carry out this survey. De Funck seems to have completely disappeared. Major Mace seems to have concentrated only on the southern portion of the town. He gave in his report that the town was woefully undefended and gave several suggestions, including the fact that a new line of fortification should be constructed from sea to sea, that is from Dungaree all the way to Back Bay. The Court of Directors in London were absolutely unwilling to spend any more and stopped all such works as could be left alone. After 1858, the outforts seem to have lost their importance. Just some minor repairs will be carried out over the next century. And by the late 19th century, most of the fortifications had been demolished or abandoned. The government now began to concentrate on harbor defenses because they firmly believed that if an attack came, it would come by sea. They were not going to be attacked from the land. And these red dots that I put are the batteries that were put up across the southern edge of Bombay. And the yellow ones were floating batteries. They felt they would again have those barges with the guns on them, and these would move up and down in the creek, protecting the island. They were going to build more batteries at Karanja, but unfortunately the shoals in the creek during monsoons, whatever they were building was actually just breaking. So they gave up on that idea. Batteries were also constructed at Kolaba. Down here you can see battery, and at Valkeshwar, which you had for quite a long time at what is the governor's bungalow. And so in 1875, we find that Mazgaon Fort has disappeared. In an account by a gentleman called J.M. McLean, he's talking about the Bandarwada reservoir being built. The fort has disappeared from there. At Sivri, the fort and the gunpowder magazine were in ruins. And in 1881, James Douglas tells us that the Scion Fort was in process of being demolished, apparently because they were going to construct a leper hospital on site. However, the leper hospital plan. So what remains of these fortifications today? Bombay Castle still exists. In 1940, Bombay Castle was authorized as HMI in 1950, and the next year it got changed to INS Angre. It is at present part of the naval headquarters of the Western Naval Command, and civilians cannot just visit it. You need special permission from the Navy to visit it. The fort is standing still strong. A lot of its original construction still intact because the Navy did a wonderful restoration project some years ago, and it's been beautifully restored by Dr. Kirti Daunwala and her team. So this is the front gate of the Bombay Castle. The reason why I have put two is because just about a decade and a half ago, this is what it looked like. They were completely painted. After the restoration has taken place, thankfully, all that paint has been removed off the old castle. This is that lantern on the top, and you have these two Portuguese sailors on the side holding the globe. This is a lovely old sundial in there. Of course, there is, some will say it's Portuguese, some say it's not. These are the two sides of it. This is what it looked like when they painted it over. Now the paint has been removed. This is the rear side of that sundial. Fort George was also demolished in 1863. St. George's Hospital now stands at the same site, and one bastion of Fort George is still standing on the hospital grounds. You can see this. This is the view from P. de Mello Road, or the old Frere Road. It is now the headquarters of the Maharashtra State Directorate of Archaeology and Museums. So this is the bastion that is still remaining. This is the office of the Directorate of Archaeology and Museums. They unfortunately called it St. George's Fort. It is not St. George's Fort, it is Fort George. Fort St. George is in Madras. This is the ramparts that you can see of Fort George. It's still quite nicely preserved. This is Mahim Fort, unfortunately in a terrible, terrible state because people are living inside it. You can't go inside. They do not like average ordinary Joes going in and looking at their place. This is the lovely gate here, and you can see the bastions on the water. This unfortunately is not a very clear picture, but this is the entry gate to Mahim. These are its bastions. This is of course the angular bastion and the round bastion of Mahim. The angular bastion again with houses inside. And here you can see the rampart walls and another bastion on the side. And you can see that not only have they got houses in here, but they've got a second story built on top of it. This fort obviously was built really strong because it's actually still withstanding all this. And during the monsoon, withstands the lashing of the waves as well. This is now Dharavi Fort. These pictures are taken by a gentleman called Ashutosh Bijur, who even find the fort very easily. He has in fact put a pin in Google Maps so you could actually find it. And it's still standing, but again, people are living inside it. This is the plaque that I was telling you about, that it was built by Governor Horn in 1737. This is the only way you can get in and out of the fort. You need a ladder to get in. There is over there this sort of little tunnel underground, which seems to be a store of sorts where they would have stored either their food or maybe was a powder magazine. This is Silvery Fort. Silvery Fort, as you can see, has had a major facelift. The ASI has done this and made it entirely out of cement concrete. Now the stone is all gone. Very irregular shape of fort, but you can see its demi-bastion out there. It sits very beautifully right on the creek, and you're looking across at Trombay and Elephanta over here. So the view from Sivri is really amazing, which sort of was required to ensure nobody was trying to sail up the creek. This is Worley Fort. Worley Fort has also had a facelift from the ASI many years ago. It's actually in quite a good condition, but of course there are houses all around it and this garbage all around it as well, with people painting things on top of it also. You can actually see Worley Fort quite easily when you're on the sea link. In fact, I think most people had not ever seen Worley Fort until they got onto the sea link and saw it over there. This is the entrance into the fort, and inside there is a mandir and a gymnasium in the fort. This is Scion in the worst condition possible, poor thing. This is that ascending staircase to go up on top of the hill. The views from there are still magnificent, but the fort itself is in shambles. It's probably because it was partially demolished in order to, completely demolish it to make way for that leper hospital, but nobody bothered to look after it after that. And this is the condition it is in today. You have people coming and sitting here because, as I said, the views are magnificent. There is an old gun lying around, an old cannon lying around. Now, two other forts are still there. These both belong to the Navy. This is Middle Ground Battery. You would have seen Middle Ground Battery if you were going on a ride to Elephanta or wherever. You can actually see it from the gateway itself. Some years ago, it actually suffered a lot of damage with the waves, and a part of it just absolutely collapsed. This is because Middle Ground has been built on just a rocky shoal in the creek, but it has been restored by the Navy. And the other one is Oyster. Oyster Rock, you can see if you are at INS Ashwini, at Navy Nagar, or even if you're at Radio Club, you can see Oyster over there. It was also built as a fortress in the creek in order to prevent enemy ships or anybody else trying to come up the creek. It is in a sad shape as well. Some years ago, the Maharashtra state government wanted to take it away from the Navy and make the cruise terminal over here. That didn't work out, and the Navy, there is a proposal to make it into a museum. So let's see, maybe if that happens, Oyster will be saved. So that is it. This is the story of our lost Sentinels of Bombay. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for being a very patient audience.